Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something that sounds, at first, almost absurd. We are going to talk about clothes that could get you in trouble with the law. Not stolen clothes, not indecent clothes, just ordinary fine clothes. A good coat, a bright colour, a particular fur, worn by the wrong person. Because in Tudor Britain, what you were allowed to wear was written into the law of the land, and to put on the wrong garment was not merely bad taste. It was, quite literally, a crime. It is one of the strangest features of that strange and distant world. We think of clothes as a matter of personal choice, of money and taste, of expressing who we are. The Tudors thought of clothes as something closer to a uniform issued by society itself, a precise visual code that announced your exact place in the order of things, and that was never, ever to be worn above your station. And to make sure of it, they passed laws, real laws with real penalties, dictating in extraordinary detail who might wear silk and who might not, which ranks could wear which colours, how much gold a person might carry on their back, and what kind of fur was permitted to whom. Tonight, we are going to wander through that whole peculiar system, gently, and look at the clothes that were, for most people, against the law. Now, before you settle in, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from in the world and what time it is. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find it strangely soothing to picture all of us, scattered across the world, lying in the dark, declining to sleep at a sensible hour. And if this channel helps you drift off, tap that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure at all. I will be here regardless, murmuring quietly in the dark about the forgotten rules of a forgotten world. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some soft background hum, and get comfortable, because tonight we are going somewhere where it would not have been, where the very cloth on your back could mark you as a criminal, and where a man might be fined and stripped of his fine coat for the crime of looking too good. Have you ever wondered why, in all those old portraits, the great and the powerful are so swathed in velvet and fur and gold, while everyone else is in plain wool and russet brown? Have you ever wondered whether that was simply a matter of who could afford what, or whether something more deliberate was going on? Have you ever wondered what would actually happen to an ordinary Tudor man who saved up, bought himself a fine silk doublet, and dared to wear it through the streets? Well, tonight you are going to find out. So settle back, and let us step into a world where getting dressed in the morning was governed by the law of the land, and where the clothes on your back told everyone, instantly and unmistakably, exactly who and what you were. Let us begin with the idea itself, the strange and rather wonderful idea that clothing could be illegal at all. To understand any of what follows, you have to first set aside a very modern assumption, the assumption that what you wear is your own business. To us, this seems so obvious as to need no stating. Your clothes are yours. You buy what you can afford and like what you like, and nobody, least of all the government, has any say in the colour of your coat or the fabric of your shirt. The idea that a law might forbid you from wearing a particular colour, or that an official might stop you in the street and find you in breach of a clothing statute, sounds less like history and more like something out of a strange dream. And yet this was the everyday reality of the Tudor world, and not only the Tudor world. These laws had a name. They are known to historians as sumptuary laws, from a Latin word for expenditure, and they were laws that attempted to control consumption, to dictate not just what people wore, but in some times and places what they ate and how much they might spend on a wedding or a funeral. But it was clothing above all that obsessed the lawmakers, because clothing, in a world without photographs or documents, or any of the modern means of identifying a person, was the single most visible and immediate signal of who someone was. And the Tudor state, like the medieval world before it, believed with absolute conviction that this signal must be kept true. These laws were not new with the Tudors. They reached back into the medieval period and beyond, all the way to the ancient world, where societies had long tried to regulate display and keep the social ranks visually distinct. But the Tudor monarchs took the project up with particular energy. Through a long series of acts of parliament and royal proclamations, stretching across the whole dynasty, they laid down, in mind-numbing and fascinating detail, exactly what each rank of society was and was not permitted to wear. These were the Statutes of Apparel, and they form one of the most extraordinary attempts any government has ever made to legislate the surface of everyday life. The crucial thing to grasp, the thing that makes the whole subject so revealing, is the assumption underneath it. The Tudors did not believe that society was, or should be, made up of free individuals choosing their own paths and their own appearances. They believed in a fixed, ordained, hierarchical order, a great chain of degree running from the monarch at the top down through the nobility and the gentry and the merchants and the craftsmen to the labouring poor at the bottom. And they believed this order was natural, God-given, and essential to the peace and stability of the realm. Everyone had a place, and everyone's place was supposed to be visible, written on their body in cloth and colour, so that the whole of society could be read at a glance, like a living diagram of itself. To wear the clothing of a higher rank, then, was not a harmless vanity. It was a kind of lie, a disruption of the natural order, a blurring of the lines that held society together. It was, in the Tudor mind, genuinely dangerous, an offence against the proper arrangement of the world. And so it was made a crime. Hold that idea gently as we begin, because everything else flows from it. In this world, your clothes were not yours. They belonged, in a sense, to your rank, and your rank belonged to the order of things, and the order of things was the business of the crown. Imagine, for a moment, walking down a street in Tudor London, and consider what you would actually see, and how completely you would be able to read it. In our world, you can pass 100 strangers and have very little idea of their station in life. The billionaire and the clerk might both be in jeans and a plain shirt. Wealth and rank are often deliberately hidden or simply not signalled by dress at all, and we have learned not to assume. But in Tudor Britain, the moment you laid eyes on a person, before they spoke a word, you knew. You knew roughly who they were, where they stood, what they were worth, and how you ought to behave toward them, because all of it was written, plainly and legibly, in what they wore. The labourer and the poorer sort were in coarse wool, undyed or dyed in the cheap, dull, earthy colours that the common dyes produced, browns and greys and a muddy reddish-brown called russet, their garments simple, practical, and unmistakably humble. The prosperous craftsman or tradesman wore better wool, perhaps a touch of modest colour, a neater cut, but still kept firmly within the bounds of his middling place. The gentleman wore finer cloth, some silk perhaps, brighter and more expensive dyes, a fashionable cut, the quiet confidence of a man entitled to look well. And the great noble blazed like a jewel, in velvet and satin and damask, in deep expensive colours, trimmed and lined with costly furs, hung with gold chains, every inch of him proclaiming his exalted place in the world. You could rank a crowd by eye in an instant, sorting every person into their proper slot, because the system was designed precisely so that you could. This was the whole point of regulating dress. Clothing was a language, and the sumptuary laws were the grammar that kept the language honest. A man's coat was a sentence that said, "This is what I am," and the law existed to make sure that sentence was always true, that no one could dress a lie, could clothe themselves in a station they did not hold. To meet a man in cloth of silver and a sable-trimmed gown was to know, with legal certainty, that you were in the presence of the very highest nobility, because by law no one else could be wearing such things. The clothes were a guarantee, backed by the state, and this legibility mattered enormously in a society obsessed with rank and precedence and deference. Knowing a person's exact station was not idle curiosity. It governed everything, how you addressed them, whether you removed your cap, who walked first through a door, who sat where at a table, who owed respect to whom. A world this finely graded by status needed a reliable way to read status instantly, and dress was that way. The visible order of clothing was the operating system of a deeply hierarchical society, the means by which thousands of small daily interactions were smoothly and correctly conducted. So when you picture a Tudor street, picture not just a crowd, but a perfectly legible diagram of a whole social order, every person a walking statement of exactly who they were. The labourer in his russet and the lord in his velvet, each in their ordained place, each instantly knowable. That was the world the laws were meant to preserve. And the fear that haunted the lawmakers, the thing that kept them passing statute after statute, was the fear that the diagram might start to lie, that people might begin to dress as something they were not, and that the whole legible order might dissolve into confusion. Let that picture settle in the dark. Now let us look at the laws themselves. The laws that governed Tudor dress did not come as a single tidy code. They came as a long, repeated, accumulating series of acts and proclamations, issued again and again across the decades. And the very fact that they had to be issued again and again tells you something important, which we will come to. But let us first understand what they actually were. Some of these regulations were full acts of Parliament, debated and passed in the proper way, becoming the law of the land. Others were royal proclamations, issued directly by the monarch under their own authority, carrying the force of law and able to be produced and amended far more quickly than an act of Parliament. Across the Tudor century, both kings and queens reached for these tools repeatedly. The early Tudor monarchs passed Apparel Acts, and the practice continued, with the great flurry of regulation coming through royal proclamations that spelled out, in ever more elaborate detail, the permitted dress of every rank, updating the rules as fashions changed and new extravagances appeared that the lawmakers wished to control. The detail of these documents is genuinely astonishing, and reading them, or reading about them, gives you a vivid sense of a state utterly determined to pin down the surface of life. They did not simply say that the rich could wear fine things and the poor could not. They went rank by rank, item by item, fabric by fabric, colour by colour, laying out precisely what a duke might wear that an earl might not, what an earl might wear that a baron might not, what a knight might wear that a mere gentleman might not, and so on down the whole long ladder of degree. They specified materials, they specified colours, they specified the use of gold and silver, the wearing of particular furs, the adornment of hats and swords and girdles and shoes. They tied permissions to rank, and sometimes to income, so that a man of a certain landed wealth was allowed things forbidden to a man of lesser means. It is worth pausing on the sheer labour of this, the official energy poured into governing something we would consider utterly trivial and entirely private. Lawmakers and royal advisers sat down and seriously debated whether a particular class of person should be permitted to wear velvet in their gowns or only in their doublets, whether silk should be allowed in a man's stockings, how deep a fur trimming might be, and on whom. The wardrobe of the entire nation was, in principle, a matter of state policy, regulated from the top with the same seriousness brought to questions of taxation or war. To the modern eye it can seem faintly comical, this grave governmental concern with sleeves and trimmings. But to the Tudors it was deadly serious, because to them the visible order of society was not a trivial thing at all. It was the very fabric, quite literally, of social stability. And so the statutes piled up, proclamation after proclamation, each one a snapshot of a state trying, with enormous effort and limited success, to freeze the appearance of its people into a fixed and legible order. We will spend the rest of tonight wandering through what these laws actually said, the colours they reserved, the fabrics they guarded, the furs they rationed, the garments they policed, and the people they bound. From the king in his forbidden purple to the apprentice in his compulsory plain cap. Let us begin where the laws themselves began, at the very top, with a colour that belonged to almost no one at all. Of all the things the Tudor laws controlled, none was guarded more jealously than a single colour, a colour so bound up with royalty that to wear it without right was to reach, in a sense, toward the throne itself. That colour was purple. Purple had been the colour of emperors and kings for thousands of years, long before the Tudors, and the reason was rooted in the simple, brutal economics of dye. In the ancient world, the deepest and most prized purple, the true imperial purple, was made from the secretions of certain sea snails, and it took a staggering quantity of these creatures, many thousands of them, to produce even a small amount of dye. The result was a colour so fabulously expensive that only the very richest powers on earth could afford to clothe themselves in it. And so purple became, across the whole sweep of history, the colour of supreme authority, the visible mark of the sovereign. By the Tudor age, the dyeing was done differently, but the association was ancient and absolute. Purple meant royalty. Purple meant the monarch. And so the Tudor laws reserved it. The richest purple silks and cloths were restricted, by statute and proclamation, to the royal family alone, to the monarch, and, in carefully specified degrees, to their closest blood relations. For anyone else, however wealthy, however noble, to robe themselves in royal purple was unthinkable, a usurpation of the visual language of kingship itself. The colour was, in effect, a piece of the crown, worn rather than held, and it could no more be taken up by a subject than the crown itself could be lifted from the royal head. This is the purest possible example of what the whole system was about. The restriction on purple had almost nothing to do with practicality, and everything to do with meaning. The colour was a symbol, and symbols, the Tudors understood, were power. To allow just anyone to wear the royal colour would be to cheapen and confuse the most important distinction of all, the distinction between the sovereign and everyone else. The monarch's uniqueness, their separation from and elevation above all subjects, was something to be guarded in every possible register, and the register of colour was among the most visible and the most charged. There is something almost magical in this way of thinking. The idea that a colour could belong to a person, that a hue could be owned, that to wear the wrong shade could be a kind of trespass against the throne. We have largely lost this sense of colour as power, though faint echoes of it survive in ceremony and heraldry. But for the Tudors, it was vivid and real. Purple was not just a colour the king happened to like. Purple was kingship made visible, and to clothe yourself in it without right was to clothe yourself in a lie so large it touched on treason. Hold that strange idea in the dark, a colour reserved for kings, and let us move down just one step to the colours reserved for the highest nobles, which were nearly as jealously kept. Just below the royal purple in the great hierarchy of forbidden colours stood the most magnificent reds, the deep, glowing, expensive crimsons, and the brilliant, true scarlet. And these too were rationed by law, permitted only to the upper reaches of the nobility, and forbidden to everyone below. Once again, the story begins with dye, because in a world before synthetic colour, the brilliance and depth and fastness of a dye determined its price, and its price determined who could wear it. The dull, cheap colours, the browns and greys and muddy yellows, came from common plants and were within reach of ordinary people. But the spectacular colours, the rich reds above all, came from rare and costly sources, certain insects and exotic materials imported at great expense, and producing a deep, even, glorious red that would not fade required skill, quantity, and money on a scale that put it far beyond the common purse. A truly fine scarlet or crimson garment represented an enormous outlay, and so it became, naturally, a marker of great wealth, and then, by law, a marker of great rank. The statutes accordingly reserved these brilliant reds for the higher nobility, gradations of crimson and scarlet velvet and silk being permitted to dukes, marquises, earls, and their like, while denied to the lesser nobility, the gentry, and everyone beneath. The richest reds clustered at the top of society, a blaze of expensive colour marking out the greatest men and women of the realm, and the further down the ranks you looked, the more the colour drained away, until at the bottom there was only the undyed wool and the cheap earthy russet of the labouring poor. The social hierarchy was, quite literally, a spectrum, the bright costly colours at the top fading to dull cheap ones at the bottom, and the law worked to keep that spectrum fixed and true. It is worth dwelling on how beautiful and how cruel this was at once. To stand in a great Tudor hall and see the nobility gathered would have been to see a riot of glorious colour, deep crimsons and scarlets glowing in the candlelight, a feast for the eye. And every glowing thread of it was a statement of exclusion, a declaration that this colour, this beauty, was not for the likes of you. The splendour of the few was built directly upon the drabness of the many, and the law made sure the two could never be confused. Colour was wealth, wealth was rank, and rank was kept visible, by force of law, in the very pigments people were allowed to put on their bodies. So when you imagine the Tudor great, picture them glowing in colours the common people would never be permitted to wear, reds so deep and rich they seem to hold their own light, each garment a small fortune and a large announcement. And picture the careful gradations, this red for a duke, that for an earl, a lesser shade for a lesser lord, the whole nobility arranged by hue like a living rainbow of rank. It is one of the most vivid images the period offers, and one of the most revealing. Let it glow softly in the dark, and let us turn now to the fabrics that were even more tightly controlled than the colours, the cloths woven from precious metal itself. Before we leave the colours behind, we must correct an assumption that the modern eye almost always makes, for there is one colour we tend to think of as plain, sober, and cheap, the safe and humble choice, that was in fact among the most expensive and prestigious colours a Tudor could wear. That colour is black. To us, black is the default, the easy option, the colour of the inexpensive and the unremarkable. But in the Tudor world, a true, deep, rich black, an even and lustrous black that did not fade to a dull greenish or brownish grey, was extraordinarily difficult and costly to achieve. The common dyes produced poor, weak, fading blacks, the muddy, near blacks of the cheap and the practical. To dye cloth a deep, pure, intense black that held its colour required expensive dyes, repeated dyeings, and great skill, a laborious and costly process that put fine black far beyond the reach of ordinary people. The result was that a genuinely good black was a luxury, a mark of wealth and sophistication, every bit as much a display of means as a brilliant scarlet or a deep crimson, and black carried, beyond its cost, a particular prestige and meaning. It was associated with the height of continental fashion, with the sober magnificence of the grandest courts, with a kind of restrained, severe, expensive elegance that the most powerful and fashionable came to prize. To dress in fine black was to make a statement not of drabness, but of dignity, gravity, wealth and taste, a sophisticated alternative to the blaze of bright colour, favoured by the most powerful figures of the age, precisely because its costly perfection signalled a status that needed no gaudy hue to announce it. The deepest, richest blacks became, in their way, as much a marker of the elite as the brightest reds, a quiet, severe, expensive splendour for those who had no need to shout. This upends our easy assumptions and reveals once more the deep logic of the whole system. Value lay not in brightness as such, but in cost and difficulty, in whatever was expensive and hard to achieve, and a perfect black was both. The man in fine black at a Tudor court was not dressing down or dressing humbly. He was very possibly dressing in one of the most expensive garments in the room. his sober elegance a display of wealth as pointed as any peacock's brilliance, his restraint itself a luxury. The drab black of the poor and the magnificent black of the great were worlds apart, the one a cheap and fading near colour, the other a deep and costly perfection, and the knowing eye could tell them instantly. So add black to your picture of the Tudor wardrobe, not as the plain and cheap default we know, but as a colour of two faces, humble and muddy at the bottom of society, rich and prestigious and costly at the top. Its meaning, like everything else, determined by the cost and quality that rank could command. It is a fitting illustration of how thoroughly the whole world of dress was about wealth and status rather than mere appearance. How even the soberest colour could be a blazing statement of means. Let that deep, rich black settle softly into the dark now. We turn to the most extravagant materials of all, the cloths woven from precious metal itself. We come now to the most extravagant materials in the entire Tudor wardrobe, fabrics so costly and so spectacular that they sat at the very pinnacle of the system, reserved for the highest of the high, and forbidden to almost everyone in the realm. These were cloth of gold and cloth of silver, and they were exactly what they sound like. Cloth of gold was a fabric woven with threads of real gold, or silk wrapped in fine gilt strips, so that the finished material shimmered and blazed with actual precious metal, catching the light with every movement. Cloth of silver was the same marvel worked in silver. To wear such a thing was to wear a fortune on your back, to be clothed in money itself, glittering and magnificent, and almost impossibly expensive. These were not fabrics one bought casually. A single garment of cloth of gold represented wealth that could have bought land or houses, or kept a poor family for many lifetimes, and it announced its wearer's status with a brilliance that nothing else could match. The laws guarded these materials at the very top of the scale. Cloth of gold and silver, and the richest tissues woven with precious metal, were permitted only to royalty and the greatest nobility, and even among them, often only in particular garments or particular circumstances. The further refinements of the law specified who might have cloth of gold in their gown, but not their whole costume, who might use it only as a trimming, who might not touch it at all. It was the most exclusive material in the kingdom, and its glitter was a near-perfect index of supreme rank. To see a person ablaze in gold cloth was to know you stood before one of the mightiest figures in the land. The most famous display of these fabrics gave its name to one of the great spectacles of the age, a summit between the English king and the French king, held in a field that became so crammed with tents and pavilions and costumes of cloth of gold that the whole event was remembered ever after as the Field of Cloth of Gold. It was an almost insane competition in magnificence, two monarchs and their entire courts striving to outshine one another in a blaze of gold and silver and jewels, a deliberate, ruinously expensive demonstration of wealth and power conducted entirely through display. It nearly bankrupted those involved, and it changed nothing politically, but it remains a perfect emblem of what these materials meant. They were power made visible, glory you could wear, and they belonged, by law and by cost, to almost no one. There is a kind of vertigo in contemplating it, the sheer scale of the wealth involved. Garments worth more than estates, worn for an afternoon's display and then set aside. It speaks of a world in which the gap between the top and the bottom was almost beyond comprehension, where a single nobleman's coat might represent more value than a whole village would see in a generation, and where the law worked diligently to keep that staggering gap visible, legible, and absolute. Let the gold cloth shimmer and fade in the dark now. We turn to a material only a little less exalted, and one that obsessed the lawmakers above all others, the smooth and seductive luxury of silk. If cloth of gold sat at the unreachable summit, silk was the great contested middle ground of the Tudor wardrobe, the luxury that the lawmakers fretted over more than any other, because it was just attainable enough to be dangerous. Silk was the fabric that the rising and ambitious most longed to wear, and that the laws most strenuously tried to keep in its place. Silk came in many forms, and the Tudors knew them all and regulated them all. There was satin, smooth and lustrous. There was damask, woven with rich patterns. There was taffeta, crisp and rustling. There was velvet, which we will come to in its own right, and sarcenet, and tinsel, and a whole vocabulary of silken fabrics, each with its own texture and price and prestige. All of it had to be imported, for England produced no silk of its own, and all of it was expensive, the product of distant lands and long trade routes and skilled foreign weaving. To wear silk was to wear the exotic, the costly, the unmistakably superior, and everyone understood it. The laws accordingly worked silk into the great ladder of rank with obsessive care. Different grades of silk, in different garments, were permitted to different ranks and incomes. The finest silks in the most prominent uses were reserved for the nobility. Lesser silks, or silk in smaller quantities, in linings or trimmings or particular items, were permitted further down the scale, to the gentry and those of certain landed wealth. And below a certain station, silk in any significant form was simply forbidden, the common people left to their honest wool. The statutes drew these lines with painful precision, specifying whether a man of a given rank might have silk in his doublet, his hose, his hat, his girdle, passing the wardrobe thread by thread. The reason silk caused such anxiety is that it was the frontier of social ambition. Cloth of gold was beyond almost everyone's reach, so few were tempted to transgress with it. But silk was different. A prosperous merchant, a successful tradesman, a rising man of the middling sort, might well be able to afford a fine silk doublet, and might very much wish to wear it, to display his success and reach toward the appearance of a higher station. Silk was exactly the luxury that money could buy, but rank, in the eyes of the law, had not earned. It was the fabric of the upstart, the social climber, the newly wealthy man dressing above himself, and so it was the fabric the laws most desperately tried to police, the exact point where the rigid order of rank met the disruptive force of money. And money, as we will see, kept winning. The whole anxious apparatus of silk regulation was, in the end, a losing battle against the simple fact that more and more people could afford the luxury the law wished to deny them. But that is a thread to pick up later. For now, simply picture the seductive shimmer of silk, the smooth satin and the rustling taffeta, the fabric everyone wanted, and the law was forever trying to keep in its proper hands. Let it slip softly away in the dark. We turn now to the richest silk of all, the one that earned a whole vocabulary of restriction to itself, the deep and sumptuous pile of velvet. Velvet deserves a chapter of its own, because no single fabric better captures the fine-grained obsessiveness of the Tudor clothing laws. Velvet was silk at its most sumptuous, a fabric of dense, soft, upstanding pile that caught the light in deep, rich folds and felt as luxurious as it looked, and the laws carved it up among the ranks with a precision that is almost comic in its detail. It was not enough for the lawmakers simply to say who could wear velvet and who could not. They went much further. They specified the colour of velvet, reserving the richest crimson and the deep blue and the costliest shades for the highest ranks, while permitting plainer or darker velvets, in smaller measure, to those below. They specified the garment, ruling that a certain rank might wear velvet in their gowns but not their cloaks, or in their doublets but not their gowns, or only as a facing or a trimming rather than as the whole cloth. They specified the quantity and the placement, how much velvet, where on the body, in what roll. The result was a bewilderingly intricate set of distinctions, a whole grammar of velvet, in which your exact rank determined not just whether you could wear the fabric, but precisely how, where, and in what colour. To us, this seems an extraordinary thing for a government to concern itself with, the placement of velvet on a sleeve, but within the logic of the system it made perfect sense. The whole purpose was fine distinction, the precise marking of each rung on the social ladder, and velvet, being both highly desirable and available in many forms and colours, was the perfect material for drawing those fine lines. By controlling exactly how velvet could be used, the law could distinguish a baron from a viscount, a knight from a gentleman, with the subtlety the system demanded. The fabric became a kind of finely calibrated instrument for measuring and displaying status, and the law was the calibration. And this points to something deeper about the whole enterprise. The Tudor social order was not a simple division into rich and poor, noble and common. It was an immensely fine gradation, a ladder with a great many rungs, each one meaningfully distinct from the one above and the one below, and each one fiercely defended by those who stood upon it. A viscount was not simply richer than a baron, he was higher, and that height had to be visible, had to be marked, had to be unmistakable. The intricate velvet rules, the colour and garment and quantity, all precisely assigned, were the means by which these fine distinctions were made visible to the eye. The system was as detailed as it was, because the hierarchy it served was as detailed as it was. So when you picture a velvet-clad Tudor lord, picture not just a wealthy man, but a man wearing his exact rank, every detail of his velvet, its colour, its placement, its extent, a precise legal statement of where he stood in the order of things, readable by anyone who knew the code, which was everyone. The velvet was beautiful, yes, but it was also information, status rendered in pile and dye, kept honest by the law. Let its deep softness fade into the dark now, and let us turn from fabrics to the parts of an animal that were guarded just as jealously, the politics of fur. Fur was warmth, and in the cold, draughty houses of Tudor Britain, warmth was no small thing, but fur was also, and more importantly for our purposes, status, and the laws sorted the furs of the world into a strict hierarchy of rank, as carefully as they sorted the colours and the cloths. At the very top stood the rarest and most prized furs, and chief among them was sable, the dark, soft, glossy fur of a small northern animal, imported from distant cold countries at enormous expense. Sable was the fur of the greatest nobility, reserved by law for the highest ranks, and to be trimmed and lined in sable was to be marked unmistakably as one of the mightiest figures in the land. Alongside it stood other costly furs of great prestige: ermine, the white winter fur famously associated with royalty and high office, spotted with black, and a handful of other rare and expensive pelts that clustered at the summit of the system. These furs were beyond price, and beyond the reach of all but the very greatest, and the law kept them there. Below these came a descending ladder of lesser furs, each assigned to its proper rank. There were the middling furs, decent and respectable, permitted to the gentry and those of certain wealth. There were the common, cheap furs, the fur of lambs and rabbits and other ordinary creatures, which the humbler sort might wear for warmth without pretension. The whole animal kingdom, in effect, was sorted by the law into a hierarchy that mirrored the human one. The rare, exotic predators at the top for the great lords, the common domestic creatures at the bottom for the common people, with everything graded in between. Your fur, like your colour and your cloth, announced your exact place. What makes the fur laws particularly striking is how they reveal the system's logic at its purest. There was nothing intrinsically noble about sable, nothing base about rabbit, except scarcity and cost. Sable was reserved for the great because it was rare and expensive, and being reserved for the great, it became a marker of greatness, and being a marker of greatness, it was guarded by law against the lesser. The value was circular, social, symbolic, a matter of meaning rather than anything in the fur itself. A pelt became precious because the law and the social order made it so, and the law and the social order then defended the preciousness they had created. The whole edifice of status display worked this way, value flowing not from the thing, but from the exclusivity attached to it. And so the Tudor great went about wrapped and trimmed and lined, in the furs of their rank, sable and ermine, declaring the highest nobility, while the law stood guard to ensure that no rising merchant, however rich, could drape himself in the sable that belonged, by right of degree, to the lords alone. The fur on a person's gown was, like everything else they wore, a sentence in the language of rank, and the law was forever working to keep that sentence true. Let the soft, dark furs settle into the dark now. We turn from materials to the garments themselves, and to the rules that govern their very shape. It was not only the fabric and the colour and the fur that the laws concerned themselves with. It was at times the very cut and shape and extent of the garments, the amount of cloth, the size of the sleeves, the length of the gown, because in Tudor dress, sheer quantity of material was itself a statement of wealth, and quantity, like everything else, was something the lawmakers wished to control. Consider the great gowns of the wealthy, those broad, heavy, sweeping garments familiar from the portraits, lined with fur, faced with velvet, falling in deep, rich folds. The magnificence of such a gown lay partly in its materials, but partly in its sheer abundance, the lavish quantity of expensive cloth, the broad padded shoulders, the voluminous sleeves, the long sweeping length. To wear so much fine fabric was a display of wealth in its own right, a way of saying that one could afford to drape oneself in yards of costly material where a poorer man made do with a plain, sparing, practical coat. The richness was in the excess, and the excess was a privilege. Sleeves in particular became a focus of display, and at times, of regulation. The great hanging sleeves, the puffed and padded and slashed sleeves, the sleeves so large and elaborate they seemed designed purely to consume fabric and proclaim the wealth to waste it, were a prominent feature of high fashion, and their very extravagance drew the lawmakers' attention. The slashing of garments, the fashionable cutting of the outer fabric to reveal rich linings of contrasting colour beneath, was another costly indulgence, doubling the fabric required and showcasing the ability to afford it, and it too featured in the calculations of who might do what. The shape of fashionable dress was, in many of its most striking features, a sustained demonstration of the capacity to consume, and the laws sought to reserve that capacity to its proper ranks. There is something almost paradoxical in this, the regulation of excess, the legal control of waste. The whole point of a vast sleeve or a deeply slashed doublet was its uselessness, its sheer surplus, the way it announced that the wearer had wealth to spare and need not be practical, and the law, by reserving such extravagance to the higher ranks, effectively made wastefulness itself a privilege, a thing one had to be entitled to. The poor were practical because they had to be, and because the law would have it no other way. The great were extravagant because they could afford to be, and because the law permitted them to be. Even the right to waste was rationed by rank. So picture the difference between the humble man's plain, close, economical coat and the great lord's vast, sweeping, fabric-devouring gown, and understand that the difference was not merely one of taste, or even of wealth, but of permission, a difference the law worked to maintain. The very silhouette of a person, the bulk and sweep and abundance of their clothing, was a statement of rank, and rank determined how much cloth you were allowed to carry on your back. Let those great gowns sweep softly away in the dark. We turn now to a particular and rather notorious item of male dress, one that the modern eye finds frankly startling. We must, in the interest of covering all the ground, address the codpiece, because no honest survey of Tudor male dress can avoid it, and because it tells us something about how fashion, display, and the assertion of status could attach themselves to the most unexpected places. The codpiece was a feature of male dress that rose to prominence in the earlier Tudor period. A pouch or flap at the front of a man's hose, where the two legs of the hose met. Originally, a practical solution to a practical problem of garment construction, but which fashion, in its restless way, seized upon and transformed into something far more conspicuous. Over time, the codpiece grew, became padded, shaped and prominent, often decorated, sometimes lavishly, with fine fabric, slashing, even jewels, until it became a deliberate and emphatic feature of the fashionable male silhouette, drawing the eye precisely where modern taste would least expect a garment to draw it. To the modern sensibility, this is frankly rather astonishing, the deliberate emphasis of a part of the body we now keep firmly unremarked in dress. But to the Tudor man of fashion, it was simply part of the vocabulary of male display, an assertion of masculinity, vigour and status, no more shocking to contemporaries than any other bold fashion is to its own age. The great and powerful wore prominent, richly decorated codpieces as a matter of course, and the most famous portraits of the most powerful man of the early Tudor period show the feature displayed with confident emphasis, a deliberate projection of dominance and virility through dress. Like everything else in the Tudor wardrobe, the codpiece was caught up in the general economy of display and could be made, in its materials and decoration, a vehicle for the same statements of wealth and rank that governed the rest of the costume. A codpiece of fine fabric, slashed to show a rich lining, ornamented with costly trimmings, was another small canvas on which a man might display his means and his standing, another place where the language of cloth and colour and adornment could speak. The fashions and the restrictions that governed dress in general touched this item as they touched all the others, folding even this startling feature into the great system of legible rank. The codpiece faded as fashions changed, its prominence diminishing as the century wore on and male dress moved toward other emphases and other silhouettes. It is remembered now as one of the more bizarre features of Tudor costume, a curiosity that provokes amusement and disbelief. But in its day, it was simply fashion, a normal and even prestigious part of how a man of standing presented himself to the world, and a reminder that what one age finds natural and dignified another may find frankly extraordinary. Let that particular curiosity drift away now, with a gentle smile, and let us turn to a feature of dress that grew so extravagant it provoked the law into one of its most famous interventions, the great and monstrous ruff. As the Tudor century wore on, a single item of dress grew, quite literally, out of all proportion, expanding from a modest detail into an enormous, elaborate, gravity-defying construction that became the defining feature of late Tudor fashion and the target of some of the most colourful regulation of the whole period. This was the ruff. The ruff began modestly, as a small frill of fabric gathered at the neck of a shirt or smock. But fashion, ever restless, seized upon it and made it grow. Over the decades, the ruff swelled into a vast, stiff, pleated collar of fine white linen, starched into rigid shape, sometimes supported on a wire frame, projecting from the neck in an enormous circular halo that framed the head like a plate. The largest ruffs were astonishing things, deep and wide and elaborately pleated, requiring yards of fine, costly linen, hours of skilled labour to launder and starch and set, and a degree of impractical magnificence that announced, more clearly than almost anything, that the wearer was a person of leisure and means with no rough work to do and money to spend on absurdity. The ruff was, in other words, the perfect vehicle for conspicuous display, and it grew ever larger and more extravagant as the fashionable competed to outdo one another, until the ruffs reached a size that struck contemporaries and strikes us as faintly ridiculous. And this excess drew the attention of the authorities, who, in keeping with the whole spirit of sumptuary regulation, sought to rein it in. There is a famous tradition that officials were stationed at the gates of the city with instructions to deal with excess, to clip or measure ruffs that exceeded a permitted depth, just as they were to break swords that exceeded a permitted length. The state physically intervening at the city's edge to enforce the bounds of acceptable display. Whether or not this was carried out as colourfully as the tradition suggests, it captures perfectly the lengths to which the authorities were willing to go, and the seriousness with which they regarded the runaway extravagance of fashion. The ruff illustrates a recurring theme in the whole story, the way fashion and regulation were locked in a perpetual chase. Fashion was a restless, competitive, ever-escalating force, always pushing toward greater extravagance, greater display, greater conspicuous consumption, as the wealthy and the ambitious strove to outshine one another and to reach upward toward the styles of those above them. And the law was forever chasing after it, trying to impose limits, to rein in the excess, to keep display within the bounds of rank and decency. The ruff grew and grew, and the law puffed along behind it, issuing measurements and stationing officials, never quite able to keep up with the relentless inflation of fashion. So picture those great white ruffs in all their absurd magnificence, framing the painted faces of the late Tudor great, monuments to impractical wealth and competitive display. And picture the officials at the city gate with their measure, gravely assessing whether a passing citizen's neckwear had exceeded the lawful bounds. It is one of the more delightful images the period offers, the solemn policing of collars, and one of the most revealing about the whole strange enterprise. Let those monstrous ruffs deflate gently into the dark now. We turn to the humblest item of all, and to a law that compelled, rather than forbade, its wearing. Most of the laws we have looked at tonight forbade things, told people what they might not wear. But there was one famous Tudor clothing law that worked the other way around, that compelled people to wear a particular item whether they wished to or not, and it is one of the most revealing of them all, because it shows that these laws were never only about rank, they were also, quite nakedly, about money and trade. The law in question concerned caps, the simple knitted woolen caps worn by ordinary people. By statute, it was decreed that on Sundays and holy days, most ordinary men and boys above a certain age, excepting the nobility and certain others of higher rank, were required to wear a cap of knitted wool, made in England, upon their heads, and those who failed to do so could be fined for the omission. The humble wool cap, in other words, was made compulsory by law for the common man, enforced with a financial penalty, an extraordinary intrusion of the state into the most ordinary corner of daily dress. Why on earth would a government compel its people to wear a particular hat? The answer had nothing to do with rank or morality, and everything to do with industry. England's wealth and economy rested heavily on wool and the making of woolen cloth, and the cap-making trade was a significant employer, a whole industry of knitters and cappers whose livelihoods depended on the demand for woolen caps. When fashion turned, as fashion does, and the wearing of these caps declined in favour of other styles and other materials, the cap makers suffered, and a depressed trade meant unemployment, hardship, and a weakened piece of the national economy. And so the state stepped in, not to forbid a luxury but to prop up a struggling domestic industry, by simply commanding the population to buy and wear its product. The compulsory cap was economic policy worn upon the head. This reveals a dimension of the clothing laws that the focus on rank can obscure. These statutes were not only about preserving the social order and keeping each degree visually distinct, they were also, very practically, instruments of economic management, tools for protecting and promoting English trades and industries, for keeping money and employment within the realm. The cap law is the clearest example, naked protectionism dressed up as apparel regulation, but the same motive ran through much of the rest, as we will see when we come to the deeper reasons behind the whole system. The laws served the social hierarchy, yes, but they also served the national purse. It is a wonderfully homely image to set beside the cloth of gold, and the sable, and the monstrous ruffs, the ordinary man on a Sunday, pulling on his plain knitted woolen cap, not because he chose to, but because the law required it, and the cap makers needed the work. From the forbidden purple of kings to the compulsory wool cap of commoners, the whole vast range of dress was, one way or another, the business of the state. Let that humble cap settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the smaller adornments, the gold and the jewels and the glittering trifles that the laws also sought to ration. Beyond the great fabrics and the colours and the furs, there was a whole further world of adornment, the gold and the jewels and the glittering small things that finished a costume and announced a fortune. And the laws reached into this world too, rationing sparkle as carefully as they rationed silk. The wealthy Tudor did not merely wear fine cloth, they hung themselves with gold. Heavy gold chains lay across noble shoulders, a favourite and very direct display of wealth, since a gold chain was quite literally a quantity of precious metal worn upon the body. Wealth made wearable and visible. There were jewelled rings, brooches, pendants and aglets, the little decorative metal tips that studded fine garments. There was goldsmith's work and gemstones and pearls, sewn onto fabric, set into hats, hung at the throat. There was embroidery worked in gold and silver thread, a labour-intensive and costly enrichment of already costly cloth. The finishing of a great costume was a further stratum of expense laid atop the fabric beneath, and it offered yet more ways to display and to compete and to proclaim. The laws, predictably, sought to control all of this. The wearing of gold and silver in adornment, of gilt and enamelled ornaments, of certain jewels and the use of precious metal in embroidery and trimming was assigned by rank, reserved in its richest forms to the higher nobility, and permitted in lesser measure, or not at all, further down the scale. The same fine gradations that governed fabric governed glitter. How much gold a person might wear, in what form, on what garment, was a matter the law presumed to decide, passing the world of adornment with the same obsessive care it brought to the world of cloth. Spangles and other small glittering ornaments, the sequins of their day, scattered light across the garments of the great, and these too fell within the reach of regulation, for they were costly and conspicuous and therefore meaningful. Nothing that signalled wealth and rank was too small for the lawmaker's attention. If it shone, if it cost, if it could be used to climb, the law had something to say about who might have it. The whole surface of the wealthy body, from the cloth outward to the last glittering aglet, was mapped and assigned and defended, a complete system of legible, rationed splendour. And here again we see the deep logic of it all, the relentless conversion of everything visible into a marker of rank. Gold on the body was wealth on the body, and wealth on the body, in this world, had to mean rank, and rank had to be guarded. The glittering adornments of the great were not mere decoration. They were, like the purple and the sable and the velvet, a language, and the law was the dictionary that kept the meanings fixed. Let all that glitter fade softly into the dark now. We turn to a question we have touched only glancingly so far, the dress of women, and the particular ways in which the laws bound them. So far we have spoken mostly of men, of doublets and codpieces and gold chains, and that is partly because the surviving laws themselves often spoke most directly of men. But women were very much part of this world of regulated dress, and their clothing was caught up in the system in ways both similar to and revealingly different from that of men. In the broad strokes, the same logic applied. A woman of high rank wore the rich fabrics, the deep colours, the costly furs, and the gold and jewels appropriate to her station, blazing with the same legible splendour as her male counterparts, while women of lower degree were held to plainer stuff. The gowns of noble Tudor women were magnificent constructions of velvet and silk and cloth of gold, jewelled and furred and embroidered, every bit as much a statement of exalted rank as anything a lord might wear, and the laws assigned these splendours to women by the same gradations of degree that governed men. But there was a crucial difference in how a woman's rank was reckoned, and it tells us a great deal about the position of women in that world. A woman's permitted dress was generally determined not by her own status, for in the eyes of the law she had little independent status to speak of, but by the rank of the man to whom she belonged, her husband, or, if unmarried, her father. A wife might dress according to her husband's degree, taking her permitted splendour from his place in the order rather than any of her own. The woman's clothing, in other words, displayed not her rank but a man's rank, made her a kind of walking advertisement of her husband's or father's standing, her finery a reflection of his position rather than an assertion of her own. This is a revealing and rather poignant feature of the system. A woman's magnificent dress was, in a sense, not hers at all. It was a statement about the man she was attached to, his wealth, his rank, his ability to clothe his wife in a manner befitting his degree. A great lady, glittering in jewels, was displaying her husband's greatness as much as enjoying her own adornment, and her right to that adornment flowed from him. The clothing laws thus inscribed upon women's very garments the dependent position they held in that world, their status derived, their splendour borrowed, their dress a sentence written in the grammar of a man's rank. And yet, within these constraints, women's dress was a realm of enormous artistry, expense and significance, and women, particularly women of the court, could wield it with great skill and to great effect, using the language of clothing to project magnificence, to compete, to make statements of their own within the space the system allowed. The greatest woman of the age, a queen who ruled in her own right, made her wardrobe one of the most powerful instruments of her reign. But she is a story we will come to. For now, hold the image of the great Tudor lady, splendid in her husband's rank, her dress, a glittering statement of a status that was, by the law's reckoning, not quite her own. Let it fade gently in the dark. We turn now to those who wore not their own finery, nor a spouse's, but their masters, the servants in livery. Here is one of the most curious twists in the whole system. We have seen how the law kept the lower orders in plain and humble dress, befitting their low station. And yet there were ordinary people, servants, who went about in fine clothes, in rich colours and good cloth, dressed far above what their personal station would suggest. How could this be? The answer lies in the institution of livery, and it reveals yet another way in which clothing spoke the language of power. A great Tudor household was a vast establishment, employing dozens, even hundreds of servants and retainers, and the greatest lords dressed these followers in livery, a distinctive uniform in the lord's colours, often of surprisingly good quality, marking the wearer as a member of that lord's household and affinity. A servant in a great lord's livery might be far better dressed than his personal rank could ever justify, clothed in fine cloth and the lord's heraldic colours, because his clothing was not a statement about him at all. It was a statement about his master. This makes perfect sense once you grasp the logic. The whole purpose of clothing was to display rank and power, and a great lord's power was measured partly by the size and splendour of his following. A lord who could put 100 well-dressed retainers in his livery was visibly, impressively mighty, his power literally embodied in the crowd of men wearing his colours. The fine clothing of the livery servant was therefore a display of the lord's wealth and importance, the servant a kind of walking billboard for his master's greatness. The clothing rose above the servant's personal station precisely because it was not really his clothing, but his lord's magnificence extended onto his back. So the same system that kept the independent commoner in russet and plain wool could put a lord's servant in fine livery, and there was no contradiction, because in both cases the clothing told the truth about power and rank. The commoner's plain dress told the truth about his own low and independent station. The liveried servant's fine dress told the truth about his master's high station, of which he was an extension and an ornament. The clothing always spoke of power and place. It was simply that the livery servant's clothing spoke of his master's place rather than his own. His fine coat, a borrowed grandeur, on loan from the great man he served. There is something to ponder here about the nature of identity and display in that world, the way a person could be, in their very clothing, an extension of someone else, their appearance dictated not by who they were, but by whom they served. The livery servant wore his belonging, his place within a great man's affinity, and in doing so partook of a borrowed splendour, while remaining, in his own person, of humble station. It is a vivid illustration of how thoroughly clothing was about the social order rather than the individual, how a coat could speak of a relationship and a hierarchy rather than a self. Let those liveried ranks fade softly now. We turn to another group bound by particular rules of dress, the young men learning their trades, the apprentices. The apprentices of Tudor towns and cities were a numerous and distinctive group, young men bound for years of service to learn a trade, and they were subject to their own strict expectations of dress, expectations that kept them plainly and soberly clothed and marked them out, unmistakably, as the apprentices they were. An apprentice was, for the years of his indenture, in a particular and subordinate position, neither child nor free man, bound to his master, living in his master's household, learning his master's craft, and expected to conduct himself and to dress himself with corresponding humility and sobriety. The expectations, enforced by custom, by guild regulation, and by the general weight of the apparel laws, held the apprentice to plain and modest dress, simple cloth, sober colours, and notably the flat woolen cap that became a kind of badge of the apprentice class. Finery, fashion, extravagance, display, all were forbidden to the apprentice, who was to look what he was, a young man in training, subordinate and unfinished, with no business aping the dress of his betters or even of free and established men. This sober dress served several purposes at once. It kept the apprentice visibly in his place, distinct from the masters and gentlemen above him, a clear and legible member of his particular order. It enforced a discipline and humility thought proper to his training, the plain coat a daily reminder of his subordinate and provisional state, and it restrained the natural tendency of young men with a little money toward display and competition and extravagance, channeling them instead toward the sobriety and diligence that their masters and the wider order wished to instill. The apprentice's plain coat was at once a uniform, a discipline, and a statement of place, and apprentices, being young men full of energy and pride and the restlessness of youth, did not always submit to these constraints gracefully. There are signs throughout the period of authorities fretting about apprentices dressing above their station, sporting forbidden finery, adopting fashions beyond their place, the eternal tension between the sober conformity demanded of them and the youthful desire to cut a dash. The very existence of repeated complaints and regulations on the point tells us that the rules were strained against, that young men chafed at their plain coats and reached, when they could, for something finer, in the perennial way of the young everywhere. The law and custom pressed down, youth and vanity pushed up. The plain coat held, mostly, but not without resistance. So picture the Tudor apprentice in his plain, sober coat and his flat woolen cap, marked by his very clothing as a young man learning his place and his trade, restrained from finery by custom and law and the watchful eye of his master, and chafing, often enough, against the restraint. It is a recognizable enough figure, the young person held to a sober uniform they would dearly love to escape, and a reminder that the regulation of dress pressed not only on the great questions of rank, but on the daily lives of ordinary young people finding their way in the world. Let that plain coat fade now. We turn, at last, to the bottom of the whole great ladder, to those who had almost no choice in their dress at all, the labouring poor. We have spent a great deal of tonight among the splendours, the purple and the gold and the sable, the forbidden glories reserved for the great. But the vast majority of Tudor people stood at the other end of the system entirely, and for them the question of what was forbidden was almost academic, because they could afford so little that the law's restrictions scarcely touched their actual lives. Let us spend a moment, then, with the dress of the poor, which is where most people actually lived. The labouring poor, who made up the great bulk of the population, wore plain, practical, hard-wearing clothing of coarse wool, in the cheap, dull colours that common dyes produced, or in no real colour at all, the natural undyed shades of the wool itself, greys and off-whites and browns. The characteristic colour of the poor was russet, that muddy reddish-brown of cheap homespun cloth, so associated with the common people that the word itself became a kind of shorthand for humble rusticity. Their garments were simple and few, made to last, mended and patched and handed down, worn until they fell apart and then used for something else, for clothing was valuable and nothing was wasted. A poor person might own very little clothing at all, a single set of working clothes worn day after day, perhaps one better garment kept for Sundays and special occasions if they were fortunate. For these people, the elaborate restrictions of the sumptuary laws were almost beside the point. The law forbade them silk and velvet and sable and cloth of gold, but they could no more have afforded such things than they could have flown, so the prohibition cost them nothing and meant nothing in practice. The laws aimed at the poor were less about forbidding them luxuries they could never reach, and more about confirming and enforcing the plainness they already lived in, keeping them visibly humble, ensuring that the bottom of the social order looked like the bottom, drab and practical and unmistakable. The poor were the baseline against which all the splendour above was measured, the plain ground from which the colours of rank rose. And yet even the poor were not entirely outside the system's reach, for the laws that compelled, like the wool cap statute, fell upon them directly, and the general principle that everyone should dress according to their station applied at the bottom as much as the top. The poor were to be plain, and were expected to be plain, and any poor person who somehow acquired and wore something above their station, a cast-off finery, a stolen garment, an unexpected gift, would have been as much in breach of the order as any upstart merchant, and rather more conspicuous. The plainness of the poor was not merely their economic lot, it was their assigned place in the visible order, the drab foundation of the whole legible edifice. There is a quiet poignancy in this, the great mass of ordinary people living out their lives in plain russet and undyed wool, their clothing a daily mark of their low and laborious station, while above them the great blazed in colours and fabrics they would never touch. The whole magnificent system of regulated splendour rested upon this broad plain base, the many in their humble wool supporting, by contrast, the visible glory of the few. And for most people, the experience of the sumptuary laws was simply this, the lived reality of plainness, the absence of colour and softness and shine, the daily wearing of one's low place upon one's body. Let that plain wool settle gently in the dark. We turn now from who wore what to what happened when the rules were broken, to the penalties that backed the whole system up. A law without a penalty is merely a suggestion, and the Tudor authorities did not intend their clothing laws to be suggestions. They attached real consequences to breaking them, and those consequences reveal how seriously, at least in principle, the matter was taken. The penalties for wearing apparel above one's station took several forms. There were fines, often substantial, levied upon those caught in forbidden finery, monetary punishments meant to sting and to deter. There was, strikingly, the forfeiture of the offending garment itself, so that a person found wearing an unlawful item of dress could have it confiscated, stripped, in effect, of the very thing they had broken the law to wear, losing both the garment and its considerable value. For those who held offices or positions, there could be the threat of losing them, the loss of a place or a privilege, as the price of dressing above one's degree. And in the background lay the general machinery of the law, with its capacity for harsher measures against the persistently defiant. The forfeiture of the garment is a particularly revealing penalty, almost poetic in its logic. The offence was the wearing of the thing, and so the punishment was the taking of the thing, the unlawful finery seized from the body that had no right to it, returned, as it were, to the proper order. There is a neatness to it that captures the whole spirit of the laws, the determination to undo the transgression, to strip away the false signal, to restore the truth of the visible order by removing the lie from the offender's back. The man who dared to wear silk above his station might find himself relieved of the silk, the law reaching out to correct the picture he had dared to falsify. Responsibility for these matters was, in various ways, spread through the machinery of local and central governance, with officials, informers, and the general apparatus of enforcement charged with watching for breaches and bringing offenders to book. The system relied, as much of Tudor governance did, on a combination of official action and the willingness of neighbours and informers to report transgressions, with the prospect, in some arrangements, of a reward or a share of the penalty to encourage the watchful eye and the ready tongue. The enforcement of the clothing laws was woven, at least on paper, into the broader fabric of how the Tudor state tried to govern the conduct of its people. But here, we arrive at the great gap between principle and practice, between the law as written and the law as lived, and it is one of the most important things to understand about the whole subject. For all the fines and forfeitures and threats, for all the elaborate detail and the grave official seriousness, the clothing laws were, in plain fact, extraordinarily difficult to enforce, and were broken constantly, openly, and on a vast scale. The penalties existed, the system was real, and yet it leaked like a sieve, and the gap between the magnificent ambition of the laws and the messy reality of their enforcement is where the real story lies. Let us turn to that gap now, to the near impossible task of policing the clothing of an entire nation. Imagine being charged with the task of enforcing these laws. Imagine being told that you must ensure that every person in a teeming city wears only the colours, fabrics, furs and ornaments permitted to their exact rank, that no merchant slips into forbidden silk, no gentleman's wife wears velvet beyond her husband's degree, no apprentice sports an unlawful finery. Imagine the sheer impossibility of it, and you begin to understand why the clothing laws, for all their grandeur, were among the most flouted laws of the age. The practical obstacles were overwhelming. How was an official to know, looking at a well-dressed stranger in the street, what that person's exact rank and income were, and therefore what they were lawfully permitted to wear? Rank was not stamped on a person's forehead. A prosperous merchant and a minor gentleman might look much alike, and telling who was entitled to what required knowledge that no passing official could possibly possess about every person they encountered. The very legibility the laws were meant to create depended on the laws being obeyed. But checking obedience required exactly the knowledge of rank that the clothing was supposed to provide, a circular problem with no easy solution. To enforce the laws, you had to know people's ranks. To know people's ranks, you relied on the laws being enforced, and the sheer scale defeated the effort. There were not the officials, the time, the bureaucratic capacity to monitor the dress of an entire population going about its daily business. The Tudor state, for all its ambitions, was a small and limited thing by modern standards, lacking the vast administrative apparatus that modern governments deploy. To actually police what everyone wore, every day, in every town and village and city street, was simply beyond its reach. Enforcement was sporadic, occasional, dependent on the energy of particular officials and the willingness of informers, a matter of the occasional prosecution rather than any systematic control. For every person fined or stripped of a garment, countless others wore their forbidden finery unmolested. The repeated reissuing of the laws is itself the clearest evidence of their failure. We noted at the beginning that the statutes and proclamations came again and again, decade after decade, monarch after monarch. A law that worked would not need to be passed over and over. The endless repetition, the constant fresh proclamations lamenting the excess and disorder of apparel and commanding obedience anew, is the unmistakable signature of a law that was not being obeyed, a state forever trying and forever failing to make its people dress as it wished. Each new proclamation was, in a sense, an admission that the last one had not worked, a fresh attempt to bail out a boat that would not stop leaking, and so the gap yawned between the law and life. On paper, a magnificent system, every rank assigned its proper dress, the whole society held in legible order by the force of statute. In reality, a constant, cheerful, large-scale flouting, people wearing what they could afford and what they fancied, the laws honoured mostly in the breach, the officials overwhelmed, the proclamations piling up unread and unobeyed. The Tudor clothing laws are, in the end, a magnificent monument to the limits of state power, to the impossibility of legislating the surface of life against the relentless pressure of money, fashion, and human vanity. And that pressure had a particular source, a particular kind of person who worried the lawmakers most of all, and to that figure we now turn. If we ask what really drove the whole anxious enterprise of clothing regulation, what kept the lawmakers reaching again and again for fresh proclamations, the answer is not the poor, who could afford nothing, nor the established nobility, who had no need to climb. The answer is a particular figure who haunted the Tudor imagination, the rising man, the upstart, the newly wealthy person of common origin who could now afford the trappings of a rank they had not been born to. This figure was the real target, and the real anxiety behind it all. The Tudor century was a time of change and opportunity, of growing trade and commerce, of fortunes made in wool and cloth and goods and money-lending, of a swelling class of merchants and traders and prosperous townsmen who were, by birth, common, but who were becoming, by wealth, rich. And these rising men did what rising men have always done. They sought to display their new wealth, to enjoy its fruits, to dress and live in a manner befitting their new prosperity, and above all, to reach toward the status and respect that, in their world, was bound up with the appearance of rank. The merchant who had made a fortune wanted to wear the silk and velvet that proclaimed success, wanted his wife in fine fabrics and his household in good cloth, wanted, in short, to look the part his money had bought. And this was exactly what the established order found so threatening. The whole system of rank rested on the idea that status was fixed, ordained, inherited, a matter of birth and degree rather than mere money. But here was money, buying the appearance of status, blurring the lines, allowing common-born men to dress like their betters and to be, at a glance, indistinguishable from them. If a merchant could dress like a gentleman, how was the gentleman's superiority to be maintained and seen? If wealth alone could buy the look of rank, then rank was no longer a fixed and sacred thing, but something purchasable, and the whole legible order, the whole comforting certainty of a society where everyone knew their place and showed it, was thrown into doubt. The upstart in his silk doublet was, to the anxious traditional mind, a kind of walking subversion, a living threat to the natural order. The clothing laws were, above all, a defence against this threat, an attempt to slam the door that money was prying open, to insist that rank, not wealth, should determine appearance, and that the common-born, however rich, should be kept visibly in their place. The endless specificity of the laws, the reservation of this fabric and that colour to the established ranks, was aimed squarely at preventing the newly wealthy from buying their way into the appearance of a higher station. The laws were the old order's resistance to the disruptive power of money, a rearguard action against the social fluidity that commerce was introducing, an effort to keep the visible hierarchy fixed, even as the economic reality shifted beneath it. And it was ultimately a doomed effort, for money is a powerful and patient force, and the rising classes were not to be permanently held down by rules about velvet. But the long losing battle against the upstart is the beating heart of the whole story. the reason the laws existed and the reason they failed. It was a struggle between birth and wealth, between a fixed order and a fluid one, fought out, of all places, in the fabric of people's clothes. Let that struggle settle in the dark for a moment. There was, though, another great motive behind the laws, quite apart from the anxieties of rank, and it was a hard-headed matter of money and trade. Let us turn to the economics. Alongside the obsession with rank ran a second great motive for the clothing laws, one that was entirely practical and hard-headed, a matter of national economics, of trade balances and domestic industry, and the flow of wealth into and out of the realm. To understand the laws fully, you have to see them not only as instruments of social order, but as instruments of economic policy. The problem, from the point of view of those who governed England's economy, was this: the most coveted luxury fabrics, the silks and the fine materials that the wealthy and the rising so desired, were not made in England. They were imported from the great manufacturing centres of the continent and beyond, and paid for with English money, with silver and gold flowing out of the country to purchase foreign luxuries. Every time an English merchant or noble bought an expensive imported silk, wealth left the realm and enriched foreign makers and traders. In an age that thought of national wealth largely in terms of the stock of precious metal a country held, this outflow of bullion to pay for foreign finery was seen as a genuine harm, a draining of the national treasure to clothe the vanity of those who could have made do with honest English cloth. The clothing laws, by restricting the wearing of these imported luxuries, served to limit this outflow. If fewer people were permitted to wear silk and other foreign fabrics, fewer such fabrics would be imported, and less English wealth would flow abroad to pay for them. The restrictions on luxury, framed in the language of rank and order, also functioned as a kind of sumptuary protectionism, a curb on the importation of costly foreign goods that drained the realm of its wealth. The lawmakers were quite explicit about this at times, lamenting the wealth lost to foreign parts in the purchase of unnecessary finery, and presenting the restraint of apparel as a means of keeping English money in English hands. And there was a positive side to this economic motive as well as a negative one, for the laws also worked to promote and protect English industry, above all the great industry of wool. We have already seen this in the compulsory wool cap, that naked piece of protectionism, but the principle ran more broadly. English wealth and employment rested heavily on the production of woolen cloth, and anything that encouraged the wearing of English wool over imported luxuries strengthened this vital domestic industry. By holding most of the population to plain English wool and reserving foreign luxuries to the few, the laws supported the looms and the weavers and the whole vast edifice of the wool trade, upon which so much of the nation's prosperity depended. So the clothing laws wore two faces at once. With one face they looked inward, at the social order, striving to keep each rank in its visible place, and to hold the upstart down. With the other, they looked outward, at the national economy, striving to keep wealth within the realm, and to protect the domestic industries on which prosperity rested. The two motives reinforced one another, both pointing toward the same conclusion, that luxury should be restrained and English plainness encouraged, and together they explain why the state cared so very much about something as seemingly trivial as the fabric of its people's coats. Let those economic currents settle now. We have spoken of the wool trade as the great foundation of it all, and it deserves a closer look, for wool was, in a real sense, the thing that built Tudor England. To understand why the clothing laws leaned so heavily toward the protection of English wool, you have to understand just how central wool was to the entire English economy and identity in this period. Wool was not merely one industry among many. Wool was, in a very real sense, the foundation of the nation's wealth, and the cloth made from it was England's great gift to the world and its great source of riches. For centuries, England had been famous above all for its wool, the fleeces of its vast flocks of sheep, prized across Europe for their quality. In earlier times, England had exported the raw wool itself to be woven elsewhere, but over time the country had developed its own great cloth-making industry, turning the wool into finished woolen fabric at home and exporting that, capturing far more of the wealth in the process. By the Tudor period, the making and selling of woolen cloth was the beating heart of the English economy, employing vast numbers of people across the whole chain of production: the shepherds and the shearers, the spinners and the weavers and the fullers and the dyers, the merchants who traded the finished cloth at home and abroad. Whole regions and towns lived and breathed wool, their prosperity rising and falling with the trade. This made wool a matter of the highest national importance, and anything that touched it touched the welfare of the realm. A strong demand for English woolen cloth meant employment, prosperity, and wealth flowing into the country. A weak demand meant unemployment, hardship, and decline. The government had every reason to protect and promote the wearing of English wool, both at home and abroad, and to be wary of anything that might undermine it, whether foreign competition, changing fashion, or the diversion of demand toward imported luxuries. The wool trade was too important to be left to chance, and the apparel laws were one of the levers the state could pull to support it. This is why the encouragement of wool and the discouragement of imported luxury ran so consistently through the clothing laws, and why measures like the compulsory cap could be enacted with a straight face. Keeping the population in English wool was not merely about keeping them humble or keeping money at home in the abstract. It was about sustaining the single most important industry in the country, the industry on which the livelihoods of a great proportion of the population and the wealth of the whole nation depended. The plain wool coat of the common Tudor man was not just a mark of his low station. It was, in a sense, a small contribution to the national economy, a tiny piece of the great wool trade that clothed the realm and filled its coffers. There is a pleasing logic to seeing the whole system this way, with the great wool trade at its foundation, the plainness of the many supporting not only the splendour of the few, but the prosperity of the nation. The clothing laws were woven, like everything else, into the larger fabric of the Tudor world, connected to its economy, its trade, its anxieties, and its ambitions. The coat on a person's back was tied, by invisible threads, to the flocks on the hills and the looms in the towns and the merchants on the seas, the whole vast machinery of the wool trade that made England what it was. Let those threads loosen and fade now, gently. We turn from the economics back to the splendour, to the very top of society, where the laws were made and, often enough, magnificently flouted, the dazzling court of the Tudor monarchs. If you wished to see the clothing laws both at their grandest and at their most thoroughly ignored, you would go to the royal court, for the court was at once the source of the laws and the place where extravagance of dress reached its most dazzling and competitive heights. The court was a peacock's paradise, a glittering arena of display in which the greatest in the land strove to outshine one another in magnificence. To be a courtier was to live by display. The court was the centre of power, the place where favour was won and fortunes made, where one's standing was constantly on show and constantly contested, and dress was among the most important weapons in this perpetual struggle. A courtier dressed to impress, to be noticed, to project wealth and taste and importance, to compete with rivals, and to catch the eye of the monarch on whose favour everything depended. The result was an environment of relentless sartorial competition, each great figure striving to appear more magnificent than the next, the fashions growing ever more extravagant and ever more costly as the competition drove them upward. Courtiers spent staggering sums on their clothing, sums that could ruin them, pouring fortunes into the silks and velvets and cloth of gold and jewels that the competitive display demanded. A great courtier might wear upon his back the value of a substantial estate, might bankrupt himself in the effort to keep up with the dazzling standard of the court, might count fine clothing among his greatest expenses and his most important investments, for to appear shabby at court was to appear unimportant, and to appear unimportant was to fail. The pressure to spend was immense, the stakes were high, and the result was a concentration of sartorial magnificence unmatched anywhere else in the realm. And the monarchs themselves led this display, for the splendour of the sovereign was the splendour of the realm, and a magnificent court reflected a mighty ruler. The Tudor monarchs understood the power of display profoundly, understood that majesty had to be seen, that the awe and obedience of subjects rested partly on the visible glory of the throne, and they dressed and staged themselves accordingly, in magnificence calculated to dazzle and overawe. The great set-piece occasions of the reign, the progresses, the receptions, the diplomatic spectacles, were exercises in the projection of power through, among other things, the most spectacular dress imaginable, the monarch and court ablaze with all the glory that wealth and rank could command. There is a certain irony, of course, in the fact that the court that produced the clothing laws was also the place of their most spectacular transcending, where the limits set for everyone else dissolved into a competition to wear ever more. But the irony is only apparent, for the laws were never meant to restrain the great. They were meant to restrain everyone below the great, to keep the splendour of the top distinct and unreachable. The court's magnificence was the whole point, the apex of the system, the dazzling summit that the laws existed to keep exclusive. The peacocks of the court were not breaking the spirit of the laws by their extravagance. They were fulfilling it, being magnificently and exclusively magnificent, while the law kept everyone else from following. Let the glitter of the court settle softly now. At its very centre stood one figure whose use of clothing was perhaps the most masterful of all, a queen who made her wardrobe an instrument of rule. At the very heart of the Tudor court, in its later and most glittering phase, stood a monarch who understood the power of dress more completely than perhaps any ruler before her, and who turned her wardrobe into one of the great instruments of her reign. The last and longest reigning of the Tudor monarchs, a queen who ruled in her own right in a world made for kings, made clothing a central part of how she projected her power, her majesty, and her carefully crafted image. Her wardrobe was, by all accounts, enormous, a vast collection of gowns and costumes of staggering richness and number, accumulated over a long reign and representing an almost unimaginable concentration of fine fabric, jewels, and craftsmanship. She dressed in magnificence calculated to dazzle and to awe, in gowns encrusted with jewels and pearls, embroidered with gold and silver, fashioned from the richest silks and velvets, designed to present her not merely as a woman, or even merely as a queen, but as something almost beyond the human, a glittering icon of majesty and power. Her appearance was a carefully constructed image, a work of political art, in which every jewel and every thread played its part in the projection of sovereign authority. This was no idle vanity. For a queen ruling alone in a dangerous world, image was power, and the construction of a dazzling, almost otherworldly royal persona was a serious instrument of rule. By presenting herself in overwhelming magnificence, she asserted her majesty, overawed her subjects and her rivals, and embodied in her own glittering person the wealth and greatness of her realm. Her clothing was propaganda, statecraft, and the assertion of authority, all woven into fabric and stitched with pearls. The wardrobe was a tool of government as much as the council chamber or the treasury, a means of making power visible and inescapable. Clothing also flowed through the court as a medium of relationship and obligation, for fine garments and rich fabrics were given as gifts, exchanged as tokens of favour and loyalty, passed between the monarch and her courtiers in the constant traffic of patronage and reward. To receive a gift of clothing from the sovereign was a mark of high favour, and the giving and receiving of fine apparel was woven into the web of obligation and reward that bound the court together. Clothing was not only worn but given, not only display but currency, circulating through the relationships of power as a token of the bonds and hierarchies it also expressed. So, at the summit of the whole system stood this masterful use of dress, a monarch who made her wardrobe a weapon and a wonder, who understood that to rule was, in part, to be seen, and to be seen, gloriously, was to be obeyed. It is the perfect culmination of everything the clothing laws were about, the conviction that appearance was power, that the visible was the real, that to control how things looked was to control, in some deep way, how things were. The greatest figure in the realm proved the principle most completely, her glittering image the very embodiment of the idea that clothes could be a kind of sovereignty. Let that dazzling image fade gently now. We turn to what it meant for ordinary people to reach upward, to dress above the station the law assigned them. We have spoken of the upstart in the abstract, the rising man who threatened the order by dressing above his rank. But let us think for a moment about what this actually meant in human terms, about the real desire and the real defiance bound up in the simple act of putting on a finer coat than the law allowed. For in that small act lay something deeply human, and the laws were, in the end, a struggle against a basic and unquenchable human impulse. To dress above one's station was, at bottom, to reach for something, for respect, for dignity, for recognition, for the visible acknowledgement of one's worth and success and aspiration. The merchant who put on forbidden silk was not merely being vain, he was claiming a place, asserting that his wealth and his achievement entitled him to be seen as more than the common man he had been born, reaching for the respect that his world reserved for those who looked the part. The desire to dress well, to display one's success, to be seen as more than one's birth, is among the most persistent of human desires, and the clothing laws set themselves against it directly, demanding that people accept and display a fixed and limited station, regardless of what they had made of themselves. And so the simple act of dressing finely could become, for the ambitious and the rising, a quiet act of defiance, an assertion of self against the order that sought to hold them down. Every merchant in unlawful velvet, every craftsman's wife in forbidden silk, every apprentice sporting a finery beyond his place, was, in a small way, pushing against the fixed hierarchy, insisting through their clothing on a worth and an aspiration the law denied them. The flouting of the clothing laws was not mere disobedience or vanity. It was, in its way, an expression of social mobility itself, of the refusal of rising people to accept the ceiling the old order tried to impose, fought out in the everyday medium of what people wore. This is why the laws ultimately failed, for they were set against not merely the power of money, but the depth of human aspiration. And these are forces that no statute can long restrain. People wanted to rise, wanted to be seen to rise, wanted to enjoy and display the fruits of their effort and success. And as more and more of them gained the means to do so, the dam of regulation could not hold. The relentless pressure of ambition, of the desire for betterment and recognition, pushed steadily against the laws, and the laws, for all their detail and their penalties, could not withstand it. The story of the clothing laws is, in this light, the story of a rising society straining against an old order's attempt to freeze it in place, and slowly, garment by garment, breaking free. There is something quietly moving in this, the spectacle of ordinary people insisting, through the humble medium of their clothing, on their own worth and their own aspirations, against the weight of law and custom and the fixed certainties of rank. The forbidden silk doublet was, in its small way, a declaration of independence, a refusal to be defined and limited by birth, a reaching toward a freer world in which what you made of yourself might matter more than what you were born. The laws called it disorder, we might call it hope. Let that quiet defiance settle in the dark. We turn now to a side of the story we have not yet touched, the surprising value of clothing itself, and the long second lives that garments led. We who live amid cheap and abundant clothing who can buy a new garment for a trifle and discard it when it bores us, find it genuinely hard to grasp how valuable clothing was in the Tudor world, and how this value shaped the entire life of every garment, giving clothes a significance and a long second life that we have entirely lost. In a world before machines, every piece of cloth was made by hand, the wool or flax or silk spun by hand, woven by hand, dyed and finished and cut and sewn by hand, in a process of enormous labour. This made cloth, and the garments made from it, genuinely expensive and genuinely valuable, a significant store of wealth in their own right. A good garment represented a real investment, and it was treated accordingly, with a care and a seriousness that would strike us as extraordinary. Clothes were not casually acquired and casually discarded. They were bought or made with deliberation, worn with care, maintained and mended and cherished, and valued as the substantial possessions they were. This value gave clothing a remarkable second life, for garments were far too precious simply to wear out and throw away. They were handed down, from parents to children, from masters to servants, passed along as the upper layers of society discarded last season's fashions to those below. They were left in wills, named and bequeathed as the valuable property they were, a fine gown passing as a meaningful inheritance from one generation or one person to the next. They were bought and sold second-hand, a whole trade existing in used clothing, allowing garments to circulate down through society, the finery of the great eventually reaching, much worn, the backs of the humble. A single fine garment might pass through many hands over many years, descending the social scale as it aged, its life far longer than the life of any garment we own. This circulation, incidentally, complicated the clothing laws still further, for it meant that fine garments, made for the great, could end up, through gift or inheritance or the second-hand trade, on the bodies of people far below the rank for which they were intended. A servant given a master's cast-off finery, a poor person who acquired a second-hand silk, might find themselves wearing, quite innocently or quite deliberately, clothing far above their lawful station. The long downward life of garments worked directly against the law's attempt to keep dress matched to rank, sending the fabrics of the great trickling down through society in ways the lawmakers could neither prevent nor control. And clothing's value made it, too, a target for theft, a frequent object of crime, stolen from washing lines and bedchambers and travellers, valuable enough to be worth the risk, and easily enough sold on through the second-hand trade. The records of the period are full of stolen clothing, a reminder of just how precious these everyday things were, how much wealth was bound up in the coat on one's back and the linen in one's chest. In a world where a garment could represent weeks or months of an ordinary person's earnings, clothing was wealth, and wealth, then as now, was stolen. Let that long second life of clothes fade gently now, the garments passing down through the hands and the years. We turn, as our subject draws toward its close, to the slow death of the laws themselves. Every system, however grand, has its end, and the elaborate edifice of Tudor clothing regulation, for all its detail and ambition, eventually crumbled and was swept away. The story of how it died is as revealing as the story of how it lived, for it tells us why such laws had become, in the end, unsustainable. The laws had always strained against reality, as we have seen, flouted constantly, reissued endlessly, never truly enforceable across a whole population. But over time the strain grew worse, the gap between the law and life ever wider, as the forces working against the system steadily strengthened. The rising commercial classes grew in number and wealth and confidence. The pressure of fashion and ambition mounted. The sheer impossibility of policing the dress of an increasingly prosperous and mobile society became ever more apparent. The laws had been an attempt to freeze a social order that was, in fact, in motion, and as that motion accelerated, The frozen image the laws demanded grew more and more out of step with the moving reality beneath. When the Tudor dynasty gave way to the one that followed, the apparel laws, the great statutes that had attempted to govern dress, were swept off the books, repealed by Parliament in the early years of the new century. The detailed legislative framework that had tried for so long to dictate who could wear what was simply abolished, abandoned as the unworkable and outdated thing it had become. The grand project of legislating the surface of society, of holding the visible order fixed by force of statute, was given up, an admission, in effect, that it had failed and that the world had moved beyond it. This did not mean that all attempts to influence dress vanished overnight, for monarchs continued for a time to issue proclamations and to fret about excess and disorder in apparel, reluctant to surrender entirely the old dream of a regulated appearance. But the great statutory machinery was gone, and the energy behind the whole enterprise was fading. The world was changing in ways that made the old project increasingly hopeless. The commercial classes were rising irreversibly. Wealth was becoming, more and more, the real determinant of how people lived and dressed, regardless of birth. The fixed, ordained, legible hierarchy that the laws had been meant to preserve was dissolving into a more fluid order in which money talked ever louder, and against that dissolution, no clothing law could stand. And so the laws faded into history, a curious relic of an older way of thinking about society, about rank, about the relationship between appearance and worth. They left behind them the fascinating record of their ambition, the detailed statutes and proclamations that show us, more vividly than almost anything else, how the Tudor mind conceived of the social order and how desperately it sought to keep that order visible and fixed. But the world they had tried to preserve was passing, and they passed with it, swept away by the rising tide of wealth and ambition and change that they had never been able to hold back. Let that fading settle gently in the dark. We turn now to ask what the whole strange enterprise really meant, and whether it is as foreign to us as it first appears. It would be easy, lying here in the warm dark, to feel comfortably superior to all this, to shake our heads at the quaint absurdity of a society that legislated the colour of coats and forbade the wearing of silk. How strange, we might think, how primitive, how utterly unlike our own free and sensible world, where everyone wears what they please. But before we grow too pleased with ourselves, it is worth turning the mirror around, for the truth is that we have not escaped the deep impulse behind the clothing laws nearly as completely as we like to imagine. We no longer have laws dictating who may wear what. This is true, and that is a real and meaningful freedom. But the use of clothing to signal status, to mark belonging, to announce wealth and rank and aspiration, is alive and flourishing all around us, conducted now not by law but by other means just as powerful. We read each other's clothing constantly, sorting and judging and placing one another by what we wear, just as the Tudors did. We have our own coveted luxuries, our own markers of wealth and taste, our own subtle and not so subtle codes by which the knowing eye can place a person on the social ladder. The brand on a bag, the cut of a suit, the particular and expensive plainness of real wealth, all of it speaks the same language the Tudors spoke, the language of status worn upon the body. And we have our compulsions and prohibitions too, even if they do not come as statutes. The dress codes of workplaces and institutions and occasions dictate what we may and may not wear in countless settings, enforced not by fines but by exclusion, disapproval, the loss of a job or a place. The uniform of the schoolchild, the required dress of the professional, the unwritten but ironclad codes of various social worlds, all of these regulate clothing as surely as any Tudor proclamation, marking belonging and rank and conformity through dress. We may not be fined for wearing the wrong thing, but we are judged, excluded, placed, in ways that can carry consequences as real, in their own fashion, as any forfeited garment. The deep impulse, then, The impulse to use clothing as a marker of status and a means of social sorting, to read and judge and place one another by appearance, to signal who we are and where we belong through what we wear, is not a quaint Tudor peculiarity at all. It is a permanent feature of human social life, expressing itself differently in different ages but never disappearing. The Tudors expressed it through law, through statutes reserving purple to kings and silk to the rich. We express it through markets and brands and codes and unwritten rules. The mechanism has changed. The underlying human reality, the deep entanglement of clothing with status and identity and belonging, has not. There is humility in recognizing this, and perhaps a little wisdom too. The Tudors were not strange aliens obsessed with a triviality we have outgrown. They were human beings grappling, in their own way, with the same realities we grapple with. The way appearance shapes how we are seen and treated. The way clothing carries meaning far beyond mere covering and warmth. They simply did openly and by law what we do quietly and by custom. And when we smile at their statutes about velvet and fur, we might pause to wonder what future ages will make of our own elaborate and unspoken codes, our own coveted brands and required uniforms, our own endless reading of one another's clothes. Let that thought settle gently. We have one more thing to consider, the deepest meaning of it all, before we let the whole subject drift away into sleep. As we come to the end of our long wander through the regulated wardrobes of Tudor Britain, let us pause and ask the deepest question of all. What was this whole extraordinary system really about? What does it tell us, in the end, about that world and its people, and about the strange and powerful thing that clothing is? At its heart, the system was about control and about anxiety. A society that legislates the surface of its people's lives in such obsessive detail is a society deeply anxious about order, about the maintenance of its hierarchies, about the threat of change and confusion and dissolution. The endless, detailed, repeated laws were the expression of a profound need to keep the world fixed and legible, to ensure that everyone stayed in their place and showed it, to defend a particular vision of how society should be arranged against the forces that threatened to dissolve it. The clothing laws were, in a sense, the anxiety of a hierarchical order made visible, the desperate effort of a fixed world to remain fixed in the face of a changing reality. And the system reveals, too, the immense power that the Tudors invested in appearance, in the visible, in the surface of things. We tend to think of appearances as superficial, as opposed to some deeper reality beneath. But the Tudors understood, in their bones, that appearance was not superficial at all, that the visible order of society was the social order, that to control how things looked was, in a profound sense, to control how things were. Clothing was not a trivial covering over the real business of life. Clothing was a primary medium through which power, rank, identity, and order were created and maintained and known. To dress was to declare what you were, and a society in which everyone's declaration was true and fixed was a society that held together, while a society in which the declarations grew false and fluid was a society coming apart. This is why the whole subject, for all its apparent triviality, opens a window onto the deepest concerns of the age, onto its vision of order and hierarchy, its anxieties about change and mobility, its understanding of the relationship between the visible and the real. The laws about velvet and fur and purple were not really about velvet and fur and purple. They were about the kind of world the Tudors wished to live in and were desperate to preserve, a world of fixed and ordained and visible degree, in which everyone knew their place and showed it, and the great order of things stood firm and legible against the chaos that change might bring. The clothes were the language, the order was the message, and the failure of the laws, their endless flouting and eventual abandonment, tells us something hopeful and human, that the fixed order they sought to preserve could not, in the end, be preserved, that the forces of wealth and ambition and aspiration and change were stronger than any statute, that people would insist, in the end, on a world in which what they made of themselves might matter more than what they were born. The slow defeat of the clothing laws was a small part of the slow movement toward a more fluid and open world, a world that we, for all its imperfections, have largely inherited, in which you may wear purple if you please, and no official will stop you at the gate. Let that quiet victory settle warmly in the dark, and let us begin, now, to set the whole subject down and drift towards sleep. Let us linger, before sleep, on a small and quiet thing that this whole strange history can give us, a gift it offers if we pause to notice, which is a fresh appreciation of a freedom we possess so completely that we never think about it at all. You got dressed this morning, or you will get dressed tomorrow, and in doing so you exercised a freedom that would have astonished a Tudor, a freedom they would scarcely have been able to imagine. You opened your wardrobe or your drawer, and you chose. You chose your colours, with no thought of which were reserved for kings. You chose your fabrics, with no official to tell you that silk was beyond your station. You put on whatever you pleased, in whatever combination suited your mood and your day, and at no point did the question of your rank, your birth, your legal entitlement to this colour or that material so much as cross your mind. The whole vast apparatus of permission and prohibition that governed Tudor dress is simply gone, so completely gone that its absence is invisible to us, an unnoticed freedom woven into the most ordinary moment of the day. Think of what that absence represents. It represents the dissolution of the entire fixed order that the clothing laws existed to preserve, the passing of a world in which your birth determined your place, and your place determined your appearance, and your appearance was the business of the state. We have inherited a world in which, at least in the matter of dress, we are free, free to present ourselves as we choose, free to dress above or below or athwart any station, free to wear the colours of kings without fear, free to make of our appearance an expression of ourselves, rather than a declaration of an assigned and inescapable rank. It is a small freedom, perhaps, in the grand scheme, but it is a real one, and it was not always there, and it was not won without the long, slow, patient pressure of generations reaching for a more open world. There is something worth savouring in this, lying in the warm dark, the quiet pleasure of a freedom so complete we forget we have it. The next time you choose what to wear, you might spare a thought for the Tudor who could not, for whom every garment was assigned, every colour rationed, every fabric a matter of law and rank, and you might feel, just for a moment, the lightness of the freedom you carry without noticing. The drawer you open without a thought would have been, to them, a thing of wonder, a wardrobe unbound by law, a daily choice that was genuinely yours. And this, in the end, is one of the gentle gifts that history gives, the power to see our own ordinary lives freshly, to notice the freedoms and comforts we take for granted by glimpsing the world in which they did not exist. We are not better people than the Tudors, but we live, in this small matter and many others, in a freer world, and that freedom was made, slowly, by the passing of systems like the one we have explored tonight. Let that quiet appreciation settle warmly over you now, the simple, unnoticed, hard-won freedom of choosing your own clothes. We are almost at sleep. One last gentle thought, and then we let it all go. Here is the last thing to hold, before we drift away entirely, and it is the gentlest thought of all. For all that the clothing laws were about control and anxiety and rank, beneath them lay a truth about cloth and clothing that is not anxious at all, but rather tender and human and worth carrying into sleep. The reason clothing mattered so much, the reason it could be worth legislating and worth defying and worth so much money and so much meaning, is that clothing is close to us in a way almost nothing else is. It touches our skin all day. It is the boundary between ourselves and the world, the thing we present, the thing through which we are seen and known. It carries our warmth and our comfort, shields us from cold and rain and the rough edges of the world, holds us through the long day, and is set aside, at last, when we lie down to rest. Clothing is intimate, constant, and deeply human, woven into the texture of every life that has ever been lived. And that is why it carries so much meaning, why it could become the focus of such elaborate law and such fierce desire. It matters because it is so close, and there is a long, warm continuity in this, connecting us to the Tudors and to every age before and since, the simple human relationship with the cloth that covers and warms and presents us. The Tudor labourer pulling on his plain wool against the morning cold, the great lady settling into her furred and jewelled magnificence, the apprentice in his sober coat, the queen ablaze in her glittering gowns, and you, tonight, wrapped in whatever soft and comfortable thing you wear to sleep, are all joined in this, the ancient and intimate human act of clothing the body, of finding in cloth our comfort and our warmth and our presentation to the world. The laws and the ranks and the anxieties fall away, and what remains is just this, the warm and tender relationship between a person and the cloth that holds them. So as you lie there now, feel the soft fabric against your skin, the blanket over you, the comfortable familiar cloth in which you rest, and feel in it not the anxious weight of rank and law, but the simple, ancient, human comfort of being clothed and warm and held. That comfort is yours, freely, with no law to govern it and no rank to assign it. The plain gift of cloth to the body, the same gift it has always been, beneath all the elaborate systems that humans have built upon it. The Tudors wrapped this simple comfort in a vast machinery of meaning and control. You can simply enjoy it, here, in the warm dark, the soft cloth and the gentle warmth, and the deep ease of a body at rest. Let the machinery fall away then, all of it, the laws and the colours and the ranks and the furs, and let there remain only the simple warm comfort of the cloth that holds you now, as you slip towards sleep. That is the deepest truth beneath the whole long story, the quiet power of cloth to comfort and to warm, and it is yours tonight, freely and completely, with nothing to govern it but your own gentle ease. Let it carry you now, softly, down towards sleep. So let it all go now, gently, the whole glittering, anxious, elaborate world we have wandered through tonight. Let it fade, the way a great procession passes and disperses, the colours and the velvets and the furs moving away down the long road of time until they are only a distant shimmer, and then not even that, and then quiet. Let the purple return to the kings, and the kings lie down to their long rest. Let the cloth of gold be folded away, and the sable and the ermine and the great ruffs deflate, and the jewels be locked in their cases, and the whole shining apparatus of rank be set down at last. Let the merchant take off his forbidden silk, and the apprentice his sober coat. Let the great lady set aside her borrowed splendour, and the poor man hang up his plain wool. And let all of them, the high and the low, the watched and the watching, drift off into the same gentle dark, where rank means nothing, and the colour of your coat means nothing, and there is only rest. They are all long gone now, every one of them, the lawmakers and the lawbreakers, the peacocks of the court and the plain folk in russet, all of them centuries at peace, beyond all rank and all law and all the anxious sorting of the world. Let them rest. And now, at last, so can you. Feel the soft cloth against your skin, warm and comfortable, and entirely your own, chosen freely, governed by no law, assigned to no rank, simply yours. Feel the weight of the blanket over you, and the way the bed holds you, and the deep ordinary safety of your own gentle sanctuary, where you may wear what you please, and be what you make of yourself, and open your wardrobe each morning to a free and unbound choice. Feel your breathing slow and your shoulders soften, and the small cares of the day loosen their grip one by one, and drift away into the dark like lights going out, gently, across a sleeping town, until there is only you, and the warmth, and the slow rising tide of sleep. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, and no colour you must not wear, and no rank you must display, and no official at any gate to measure the cloth upon your back. You are free, and you are warm, and you are exactly where you are meant to be, which is here, wrapped in soft and comfortable cloth, sinking gently down into the deep and kind dark, where the night asks nothing of you at all but that you rest. And if any last glimmer of that old bright world still lingers at the edge of your thoughts, some flash of purple, some shimmer of gold, some great white ruff or sweep of fur, let it grow soft now, and slow and distant, the way a story fades as you slip past its edge into sleep, the colours dimming, the figures receding, the whole long glittering procession dissolving quietly into the warm and shapeless dark. You do not have to hold any of it. You can simply let it drift away, like the day itself, like the last of your waking thoughts, out into the quiet, and gone. Good night, traveller. The old bright world is at peace, its colours folded away, its laws long silent. And so, now, are you. Rest easy, sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.